Hello and welcome to today's program on historical causes of Korea's division and challenges to reconciliation. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the policy director here at the Korea Society. Thank you so much to all of our audience members joining us from around the world. Today's program is part of a series called New Thought on Korea and Unification. It's supported by the UniKorea Foundation. Up to now, we've looked at Korea and unification through a series of different lenses, focusing mostly on contemporary issues that complicate or offer opportunities for inter-Korean integration. For today's program, we want to go back in history to examine sources of tension and unity within Korean society, beginning in the late Joseon period. To do so, we are very happy to be joined by Dr. Michael Shin. He's a fellow of Robinson College, Cambridge, and the author of Korean National Identity Under Colonial Rule, the editor and co-author of Korean History in Maps, and the editor and co-translator of Everyday Life in Joseon-era Korea. This is not Mike's first program with us, so if you enjoyed today's discussion, you can go to our YouTube page and check out talks on the origins of kimchi and soju, a brief history of Han, the March 1st movement, and Korean history in Maps. They're all excellent. It bears mention that today's program overlaps with our May 6th presentation by Sherman's Scholar Award winner, Dr. Aram Her. She will speak about Korea's changing national story and democratic future, so please keep an eye out for that. We'd love to hear from you all, so thanks everybody who already sent us a question. And please do continue to send those in throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. We're standing by to get them. I'm going to pop up back in the program a little bit later on, and we'll address as many questions as we can, focusing on the ones that are the most relevant. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Shin. Mike, every time you do a talk for us, I learn a great deal, and I think our audience does too. Thank you so much for joining us. The screen is now yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. And thank you to Peter for all his work behind the scenes to make this look so seamless. Now, today's topic is, of course, the most important and painful topic of modern Korean history. And that is, what are the origins of the Korean War? What's the origins of Korea's division? And this has, of course, been a major concern for historians for many decades. And of course, the Korean War divides the modern period. The early modern period covers the events leading up to the Korean War. Then the contemporary period covers the consequences of the division and the war. Now, among scholars, I believe that there is a general understanding of the causes of the war. But on a popular level, I think there is confusion. Right? To say that the North invaded the South on June 25th, 1950, is of course not a statement about causes. It just states what happened on that day. Now, part of the reason for the confusion is the complex nature of the war. Now, it was both an international conflict and a civil war. And too often, the focus, especially outside of Korea, is on the international conflict. The Korean War is only seen as part of the Cold War. So too often you will hear a journalist or a commentator, or even a scholar, say that the Korean Peninsula is the last refuge of the Cold War. It's the last place in the world where the Cold War persists. This is a view that sort of lacks a full historical understanding of Korean history. Now, think about how ridiculous that statement sounds. It means that the Cold War is so powerful that it persists in Korea even decades after it ended. It just doesn't make sense. So this is a very America-centric view that obscures the Korean part of the Korean War. So to understand the war properly, it is necessary to understand the causes of the civil conflict, the internal conflict. That is, why did hundreds of thousands of Koreans reach the point where they thought it was necessary to wage war on hundreds of thousands of other Koreans? Now, it's obvious that civil wars are rooted in deep internal divisions, but for some reason, they're not much discussed in relation to the Korean War. So this is important to address another aspect of the Cold War orthodoxy about Korea. So one unfortunate consequence of Cold War thinking is that it has normalized the fact that Koreans killed other Koreans. It's important to highlight how, in the broad perspective of Korean history, how unusual and how exceptional this is. So think about how horrible this would be for us. What would it take for you to kill your neighbor or to betray your own family? That's the thing that only happens under the extraordinary circumstances of civil war. Now, only by understanding the civil nature of the war is it possible to understand its unique features. First, the Korean War was one of the most violent civil wars of the 20th century. In popular consciousness in America, people tend to think of the Vietnam War as a very violent war. However, the Korean War was more violent. If you look at the statistics here, it had about the same level of casualties, but in a much shorter period of time. Second, the origins of Korea's division far precede the Cold War, and the division of Korea has outlasted it. So it's not that the Cold War persists in the Korean Peninsula. Rather, it's that the division is much more than a Cold War conflict. So to understand the origins will give you a much better understanding of Korea today. So Korean War is, of course, a complex topic, but I just want to give a brief overview of the historical development of Korea's internal divisions. So I'm going to leave out a lot of other important topics, but again, I think I want to focus on aspects of the war that have not been discussed. So we're going to go over it starting in the late Joseon period and how it developed into the 20th century. Now, how far back do the origins of Korea's division go? I think this is a far more important question than who caused the Korean War. It's not who caused the war, it's when did it begin? Now, the internal divisions that lead to civil war do not develop in a year or even decades. In the case of Korea, they go back hundreds of years to the late Joseon period. Now, as many of you know, the late Joseon period began with the Hideyoshi invasions of the 1590s. It was a turning point not only in Korean history, but in East Asian history. And it marked the moment that Korean history deviated from the history of China and Japan. So while both China and Japan underwent regime change, the Joseon state in Korea remained intact. But the Hideyoshi invasions were also a turning point in economic history. Korea underwent a commercial revolution as markets emerged and quickly became an important part of the economy. And here we see, this is of course from the late 19th century, of a market outside of Namdaemun in Seoul. Now the Hideyoshi invasions helped to catalyze the emergence of markets. Peasants fleeing from the Japanese armies flocked to the cities, especially Seoul, for protection. The sudden influx of people created a problem of food supply. They needed to be fed, and markets emerged to serve this need. Now, traces of the wartime origins of these markets can be found in a commonly used word today. The word for store in Korean is gage, but it originally comes from the word gaga. You see the Chinese characters here. And in this case, it refers to temporary structures. These were temporary structures that were built alongside existing stores in Seoul to accommodate the increased demand. And this occurred, of course, during that wartime period. Now, the rise of markets became apparent by the end of the 17th century, and this had a tremendous effect on agriculture. Now, farmers now could make significant profits by selling their crops on the market, enabling them to purchase more land. The peasant class began to differentiate into a small group of wealthy peasants and a growing group of landless peasants, and tenancy increased in the late Joseon period. So there were certain regions where tenancy reached 50% of the local population. And as a countrywide of networks emerged in the 18th century, inequality grew worse. So by the 19th century, there were some areas in the countryside where tenancy rates reached extremely severe levels. And there were a number of signs of growing internal divisions in culture and the intellectual world. And I'll go through three of them very quickly. First is in painting. We saw the rise of what's called genre painting, or pungsukwa. And you see here a painting from one of the most famous painters, Kim Hong-do. Now, just the fact that they depicted the peasantry is significant, shows that they are becoming more important, and it's a sign of the rise of the peasantry. But these were not quaint or rosy pictures of peasant life. It's easy to ignore the fact that they are very satirical in nature, especially satirizing the Yangban elites. You can see here a theme that exists in many works from this period, which is you can see hardworking peasants juxtaposed to lazy yangban who don't do work. Right? This is one sign, again, of growing divisions between the yangban and the peasantry. And if you look at other genre paintings from this period, you'll be surprised to see how much this appears. Second, you can see this in stories in pansori, such as Chunhyang. Now, Chunhyang is, of course, the most famous story. It's seen as a great example of love transcending class barriers and showing Chunhyang as a great example of Confucian virtue. But it's important to remember the strangeness of the story. Isn't it strange that Chunhyang is the hero of the story? It's because it shows that peasants at the time were identifying with someone of a lower status, a woman and someone of low status, right, as the daughter of a courtesan. And the Im Gwon-taek film shows this very well. What you see on the screen is a scene from the film. On the left is Lee Mong-nong, pretending to be a destitute beggar. And he's criticizing Chunhyang, saying that she didn't preserve her chastity. Then the peasants get angry at her and start beating him up. So again, so that the peasants were identifying this, and this only happens in very unusual times. Third, there was the emergence of an intellectual school that sought a more peasant-oriented reform. And this was called, of course, Shilha, or practical learning. Concerned about the deterioration of the rural economy in their time, they suggested land reform and other proposals that were meant to relieve the suffering of the peasantry. So they suggested things such as what you see as the well field system. So they wanted it to be structured like a well, like the Chinese character for well, you see on the left. And this is an old land reform policy that was recommended by Mencius. And you also have the hamlet land system, which was developed by the most famous Shillak thinker, Jung Ya-gyong. So all three of these developments were harbingers of the chronic peasant unrest of the 19th century. Now, as is well known, there were three major rebellions in that century. And there were clear signs of internal breakdown caused by this growing social divisions in the country. The Hong-Yongne Rebellion of 1811 to 1812, was called the Imsul Peasant Revolt of 1862, and the Gabo Peasants' War, or sometimes called the Donghak Rebellion of 1894. Over the course of these three rebellions, we see the growth of the peasant movement. The first was a localized revolt. The second was a number of localized revolts occurring simultaneously in the southern provinces. By the 1890s, peasant unrest developed into an organized movement that overthrew government, local government in the south, and threatened to overthrow the central government in Seoul. Now, at the same time, these are signs of internal breakdown. These can also be seen as preludes to civil war. They were the first time that large numbers of Koreans attacked other Koreans. Now, in a normal dynastic transition, a new group of power would have seized the throne, resolved these issues, and brought order. But this came at the time that Korea also faced foreign imperialism. So internal disorder led to its occupation by Japan in 1910, as you know, just 15 years after the suppression of the peasant uprising. Now, so this is the key dynamic to understand, not only just for modern Korea in general, but for the Korean War. Foreign imperialism prevented Korea from resolving its internal conflicts, thus blocking its historical development. Now, the years of Japanese occupation from 1910 to 1945 cover the period leading up to the Korean War. So obviously it must have something to do with the division. Now, most of all, its policies worsened already severe internal divisions, bringing the country closer to civil war. So just to make things clear, Japan was not responsible for creating these divisions in Korean society, but it did worsen them to the point where Korea was on the verge of civil war by 1945. And there are four main aspects of Japanese rule that I want to discuss. Now, first is the colonial economic policies. Second is ideological splits. Third is the issue of collaboration. And the fourth is the violence and the methods of violence brought into Korea through suppression campaigns, mainly suppression of resistance forces both inside and outside of Korea. And all of these further aggravated internal divisions among Koreans. Now, first, economic equality. Now, Japanese economic policies exacerbated inequality among the peasantry, worsening trends that started in the late Joseon period. As is well known, Japan, which was undergoing rapid industrialization, especially during the World War I years, wanted to turn Korea into its main agricultural supplier, especially of rice. So to secure a steady supply of rice, the colonial government's policies supported the landlord class. Now, soon after the beginning of the occupation, it began a large-scale land survey that was completed in 1918. This survey secured landlords' rights over the land by creating a modern land registration system. It also weakened the rights of tenants, making it easier for landlords to dismiss them. Now, the integration of Korean agriculture with Japan's economy created a classic rich gets richer, poor gets poorer situation. Wealthy landlords could now sell their rice at higher prices in Japanese markets, thus gaining funds to purchase even more land. As a result of this, tenancy increased to alarming levels. You can see the statistics here. Now, the statistics here even downplay the severity of the condition of the peasantry in the countryside. It shows here that it reached 50% by the 1930s, but this doesn't take into account all the peasants who just left the country, went to Manchuria or went to Japan to work. So the impoverishment of the countryside was tremendous during the colonial period. If you think about it, even 50% is remarkable. If 80% of the population was engaged in farming, this means that 40% of the total population of Korea had no property, had no land this time. You can see that, not surprisingly, the satisfaction of the tenancy increased during this period. The number of tenancy disputes increased tremendously. Of course, part of this is due to the fact that the scale of tenancy disputes grew smaller, so there were more of them. But at the same time, it does indicate how severe the problem was. So such levels of inequality led to the emergence of ideological splits. Whoops, sorry. This occurred after the March 1st movement of 1919, as interest in socialism grew rapidly. Sorry, I think I got it out of order here. No, sorry, I don't have this. Now, why did ideological splits emerge after 1919? It was the failure of the March 1st movement. That was one of the big factors behind the rise of socialism. It led many young students and intellectuals to reject Western liberalism and Christianity. Further, another factor was the disillusionment with the West as a result of the destructiveness of World War I and the West's unwillingness to apply Woodrow Wilson's 14 points to Korea. The March 1st movement also demonstrated the rise of a mass politics in Korea. It showed the power of mass movements. So in socialism, young students found an ideology of a mass movement that explicitly called for the liberation of colonies, unlike Western liberalism. And similar to what happened in China, they reworked socialist thought so that the main agent of revolution was not the industrial proletariat, but the peasantry. Now, in the 1920s, there were sharp ideological differences between the two sides. One of the main differences was, of course, their views on land. Nationalists, though many sympathized with the plight of the peasantry, supported pro-landlord positions. Socialists, on the other hand, wanted a revolution in which property would be returned to the peasantry. In other words, a land to the tillers policy. However, it's important not to exaggerate the degree of tension between them in the 1920s. Now, you see socialists working at newspapers owned by nationalists. In fact, the Donghwa-ilbo, which was owned by nationalists, had socialists on its editorial board in the early 1920s. This is something that would be unthinkable today. The tensions between the two sides grew sharper in the 1930s. Like other colonial powers, Japan employed a divide and rule approach to colonial movements. So while it was relatively tolerant toward the nationalists, it took a hard line against socialists. This made the nationalists seem close to the colonial authorities. On the other hand, arrests of socialists gave them impeccable credentials as resistors against the Japanese. Now, so another factor that aggravated internal divisions was collaboration as a result. The collaboration of a number of prominent Koreans with the Japanese left the country with a tainted elite at liberation, which of course complicated Koreans' efforts at creating unity. Now, who were the main collaborators? Some people consider like landlords to be collaborators. I mean, they needed loans from colonial authorities to fund their operations. And they also needed assistance from the police to suppress tenant disputes. And this was part of their divide and rule approach. But generally, if you look at lists of collaborators that were compiled after liberation, that were coupled recently in the early 21st century, generally, landlords are not on lists of collaborators. More prominent were businessmen, industrialists. Again, they needed financing from the colonial authorities, and they also received support from colonial policies that promoted light industrialization in Korea. They formed associations that cultivated relationships with important figures in the colonial government and in Japanese banks. You see some examples here. Bak Seung-jik, who was the founder of the Dusan group. Baek Nak-seung might be someone you're not familiar with, but you're certainly familiar with his son, Nam Jun-baek, the video artist, is here. And then Kim Yeon-soo, the heads of Gyeongsung Spinning and Weaving, is well known in Korean historiography. Now, most of them are considered collaborators, these industrials, because rather than landlords, because they made direct contributions to Japan's war effort. A third group were literary figures. Now, Japan put a lot of effort into trying to turn novelists, poets into supporting their rule. And you see examples here. Lee Kwang-soo, the most popular novelist of the time, Choi Nam-sun, a poet and the author of the Declaration of Independence from 1919, and one of the most popular historians of the time. Now, how did Koreans feel about collaborators during that colonial period? It seems to be pretty obvious, but let me give you an example here. Probably the most infamous collaborator is Lee Wan-yong, the prime minister at the end of the Joseon period who signed the annexation treaty with Japan. Now, he died in February 1926. And the newspapers at the time provide a slight view into readers' feelings about him. So this is an article that appeared the day after his death. And it's just from a section that was supposed to be satirical. It's a famous section, right? Now, it says here, the very first thing is about Lee Wan-yong. It says, Marquis Lee Wan-yong died yesterday. He must be very weary on his journey to hell. Now, this is a section that, again, was where certain criticism was allowed, but even considering that, this is a very strong statement of anger toward a collaborator. And there are stories that many collaborators who died in this period would deliberately put their graves in a very hard to reach spot so that the tombs could not be defaced by people angry at collaborators. And so there's a tremendously emotional issue. And part of that intensity of these emotions can be explained by the severe internal divisions at the time. Now, another major factor that contributed to division was Japan's use of a scorched earth policy in suppressing armed resistance. And this goes back to the late 19th century. It started with the Galvo Peasants' War of 1894. And some of you may know, this was the immediate cause of the Sino-Japanese War. When the peasant rebellion broke out, the Korean government was unable to suppress it, so it asked China for help. But under terms of a treaty between China and Japan, China had to notify Japan, and Japan sent troops in and used it as a pretext to launch the Sino-Japanese War. Now, while it waged war on China, Japan also suppressed the peasant resistance. And the Japanese army's first massacre of civilians occurred at this time. And they killed entire villages where suspected peasant soldiers were, and then burned them to the ground. It is estimated that at least 50,000 peasant soldiers and their families were slaughtered in these campaigns. you can see some pictures here. Now, the Japanese army conducted another suppression campaign after it disbanded the Korean army in August 1907. Perhaps the most infamous incident in this campaign was the Jjun Massacre of 1907. You see Jjun here in Chungcheong province. This became famous because a Canadian journalist observed it, and he wrote about it later. This was F.A. Mackenzie, who wrote about it in his book, The Tragedy of Korea. And he wrote, and this is a bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth reading. The Japanese then determined to make Jjun an example to the countryside. The entire town was put to the torch. The soldiers carefully tended the flames, piling up everything for destruction. Nothing was left save one image of Buddha and the magistrate's yamen. Never have I witnessed such complete destruction. Where a month before there had been a busy and prosperous community, there was now nothing but lines of little heaps of black and gray dust and cinders. Jjun had been wiped off the map. Where are your people? I asked the few searchers. They are lying on the hillsides, came that reply. So this established a pattern that was continued into the colonial period. This happened during the March 1st movement. You see this in the Jeamni massacre. Right? Japanese employed the same tactics to suppress the exile independence movement. But what's different about the colonial period is that they were using Koreans in these campaigns. Koreans staffed the lower levels of the colonial police force. And some of them also served in the Japanese army, especially the Kanto army. So some examples you see in Manchuria are the Jandao massacre in October 1920, where 3,000 Koreans were massacred by Japanese army. Then later on, you see after the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, they created in Manchukuo, the puppet state of Manchukuo, what's called the Jiandao Special Force, and consisted of 360 Korean troops. And this was used, of course, to pursue people like Kim Il-sung and other guerrillas in the Manchuria era. So these were incidents where, again, Koreans were killing other Koreans. And so these were harbingers of the civil conflict to come after liberation. Now, I hope this historical overview, though it's very brief, gives you a better sense of how Korea was able to go from the joy of liberation in August 1945 to civil war just 5 years later on the day of June 25th, 1950. Now, this perspective can also help you to understand this observation from someone in the American occupation. And this is by H. Merrill Benninghoff, a political officer to General Hodge. And this is a telegram that he sent, to the State Department. It says, Southern Korea can best be described as a powder keg ready to explode at the application of a spark. And this was sent on September 15th, 1945. Just a few days after American troops arrived in Korea and just 1 month after liberation. So again, it was immediately apparent to the Americans how much tension there was on the Korean Peninsula. Now, the liberation period is an extremely complex period, and I don't have time to discuss all of it. So I just want to focus on aspects where we can see the landlord-peasant conflict play out in events that sort of lead up to the Civil War. And when we see the liberation period was a very turbulent, violent time. Right? And we can see immediately with the autumn harvest uprisings of 1946. These were peasant uprisings, not unlike those in 1894. Yes, it began in the city. It began in the city of Daegu with the strike of railroad workers there. But then it quickly spread to the countryside. And we see the same type of pattern that we see in peasant rebellions from the late 19th century through the March 1st movement, where peasants armed with only spears would attack armed police stations. Next is the Jeju Uprising in 1948. We see that the people of Jeju resisted the separate elections that were going to be held in May 1948. They began an uprising. Now, this became so intense and so severe that the Americans sent in troops to suppress it, believing it to be a communist uprising. Their suppression led to a decrease in the Jeju Island's population by 1/3, by death and by migration. And as many of you know, many of the Korean Japanese population were originally from Jeju Island. And you think about how dire the situation must have been, that they felt that the situation, they couldn't live in Jeju Island. So they went back to the land of their former colonial power to escape from that. So they felt that Japan was a better place to live than Jeju Island. This, of course, triggered the Yosu-Suncheon rebellion. Some of you know, the troops in Yosu and Suncheon in South Jeolla province were ordered to go into Jeju to suppress it, but they rebelled instead. And this again led to another suppression. The remnants of the forces that rebelled fled into Jiri Mountains, and they became guerrillas. And they engaged in guerrilla warfare from November 1948. Though people think they were connected to North Korea, there seems to be actually not too many signs of that. In fact, guerrilla uprisings, decreased by the time of the Korean War. But then we also see border fighting in the summer of 1949. Again, tensions between the two sides, where North and South Korea now were increasing. So not just within South Korea, but we see it increasing between the two countries now. So there are battles where one side would go up, invade the territory of the other, and kill hundreds of troops. Right? But it didn't explode into war yet, mainly because, again, North Korea did not want it. But again, these are all harbingers of the tremendous civil war that was about to start. Now, examining the long-term historical causes of a war usually clarifies what issues need to be resolved in the present to overcome its legacy. However, in Korea's case, the main issue was already resolved. The main desire of the peasantry was land reform. They wanted the land back. Right? But one of the points of, and this was one of the main points of contention from the late Joseon period through the early 20th century. But both North and South Korea, as you can see here, did land reform. Right? And this is one of the distinguishing features of East Asia with Latin America. Right? China, Japan, Korea all did land reform. Latin America did not. As you can see here, as you would expect, it was first done in the North, even before the official launch of North Korea in 1946. In South Korea, a land reform was passed shortly before the beginning of the war in 1950. It's not entirely clear how much of the land reform was done by late June 1950. Some landlords knew the land reform was coming in the South, so they sold their land in advance. So, but there's also evidence that only notices went out by June 1950 in certain regions. But in any event, the war itself, of course, helped to complete the process of land reform. So, though the core issue, the core historical issue may have been resolved, Korea, of course, is still dealing with the consequences of over a century of conflict, and not to mention the war itself. Korea has had to suffer over a century of violence where Koreans attacked other Koreans. And this is one source of the complex emotions that Koreans call Han. One of the necessary steps in reconciliation will be dealing with this legacy of violence. The question is, how can you reconcile with someone who has killed someone you know, probably someone in your own family? Now, you might notice that in Korean popular culture, there's lots of stories of revenge. A lot of you who are fans of Korean movies like Old Boy, etc., know that Koreans do revenge stories particularly well, and these become big hits. But have you noticed that there are far fewer stories about forgiveness? One example is like one of the most popular dramas, Daejanggu. She eventually, at the end, forgives the people who tortured her, who caused her to suffer, but only after she takes revenge on them. So when we see more stories about forgiveness, that will be a major sign that the country is ready to take the next step in reconciliation. Okay, All right, thank you very much. And I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
Well, thanks, Mike. Wow, so much to unpack there. Learned a great deal, and so many issues. And our viewers are tuning in and sending their questions. We got a lot. So what I'll do is I'll throw them in your court, and you could sort of answer the ones that inspire you. I'll try to bundle them up in related categories. So the first one. So much of your talk today has focused on sources of tension that defy any geographic border, tensions between the landlords and the peasants, etc. We received 3 questions that ask about the differences between North and South before and after the war. So first question 1. This comes from Mark Tokola at KEI. And Mark asks, was there a sense of differentness between North and South before World War II? So that's the first one. I don't know if you want to answer that right off the bat before I go to the other 2, or if you want to get all 3 and sort of answer them together. What do you prefer, Mike?
In the interest of time, why not give me all 3, and then I'll see if I can answer them together. Yeah.
Ethan Kessler from the University of Michigan asks, do you think the odds of reunification are going down due to the growing wealth and culture divide between North and South Korea? So is this gap between, and not to mention communication, there was much more communication between even East and West Germany, right, during the Cold War than there is between North and South Korea today. So is that growing gap, wealth, culture, communication, making reunification harder? And then the last one, this is sort of an interesting one. So this is Earl Arnold's question, and Earl asks, before the Korean War, the industrialized North had a substantially higher GNP than the more agricultural South. This is similar to the situation in the 19th century United States. Are there parallels in the subsequent experience of Korea and the US that are worth exploring? So I throw those all out there, and just whichever ones sort of inspire you.
In terms of sort of separate sense of North and South identity, I'll say that there was certainly some of that, before the modern period. And as some people know, the North was a traditionally sort of discriminated part of the country. In fact, it was sort of like the Australia of Korea. That the North was a place where they sent exiles or criminals, and and people, even Yangban, who passed the civil service examination, could not rise to the top positions in the government. Right? So there was definitely a sense of difference in that sense, and there was also strong regional differences. Right? But I don't know how strong. It was certainly not as strong as the tensions we see between North and South today. And maybe it might be more accurate to say that these are more regional differences. So they're very specific about regional differences. How and this is a big feature of Korea today. People talk about the differences between Gyeongsang province and Jeolla province, and they also talk about the difference between North and South. But also what shows sort of the turbulence of modern Korean history is that this became sort of scrambled. Right? In actuality, it was the North that was more open to Western thought in the early 20th century. Christianity took root quicker in the northern part of the peninsula than the South. Right? People often forget that Kim Il-sung's father attended mission schools, Christian schools. Right? So of course, then the Christians had to move down south, after 1945. Many could not, but many did move down south, and that's one reason why we see a lot of immigration of these northern refugees to America. So, a lot of the early immigration from Korea to America in the 1960s are from people originally from the northern part of the peninsula. So there are those kind of differences. In terms of whether now this means that reunification, the chances of reunification are going down. I mean, reunification is always going to be difficult, but I think if you look into long historical factors, Korea is much more has a much longer history, unified than ununified. And I think its current situation of division is very unnatural from the perspective of a historian. So this would tend to show that, again, somehow they should work it out, but of course the politics are extremely complex and difficult. I mean, I'm not maybe the best person to talk about the politics. Maybe there are other experts who can talk more about the political aspects of it, but I don't think necessarily the differences in wealth will cause this, because even in the Joseon period, there was a tremendous disparity of wealth between South and North. The richest people were all in the South, even in the Joseon period anyway, and the country was unified. To answer the last question, I'm not sure what differences or what parallels there are to other situations, because it's such an unusual situation. I mean, the person is right to say that the North industrialization was mainly in the North in the early 20th century, and the Northern economy, the North Korean economy, outpaced the South through the 1960s, and then it changed. But of course, the differences with other places that they weren't completely cut off from each other. America was never divided, so it wasn't cut off from each other, and they've been integrated into other economies. Now, I do think that, there will be certain challenges. Like being in England, I was able to observe certain North Koreans who came to study in England, got scholarships or were sent to study in Korea, and I was amazed when I would see them walking around. That they had such an incredible culture shock just walking around England, but they didn't feel that I didn't sense an openness for them to ask me or anyone else questions about it. It just seemed that I would sometimes catch them just walking around stunned, just surprised at what they're seeing, and it's just to us a normal British town. So those kind of things will take a while to resolve, in addition to the political issues. So I hope that that provides some answers to
Totally. Yeah, and
different questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's great. So if you're interested in that question in particular, dear audience members, I invite you to keep an eye out for our May 20th program. That's going to be with Dr. Hyun-In Nae. She's a professor at Ewha Women's University, and she's also a former director at the Korean Hana Foundation, which takes defectors and refugees from North Korea and helps integrate them into South Korea. And we're going to talk about this very topic. What are the challenges to integration of people from North Korea into South Korean society from a sociological and psychological perspective? So please tune into that. Yeah, your point about Christianity flourishing in North Korea is something that we forget. Pyongyang was called the Bethlehem of the East. So remarkable to think about given the situation today. And finally, your point about regionalism is particularly well taken. That's something that often diminishes in the current conversations and in the media about North Korea, a depiction of a more or less monolithic state when nothing can be further from the truth. There remains some pretty stark regional differences, culture, history, dialect. People from different regions in North Korea consider themselves to have different types of identity just as strongly as in the South. So our next question is going to focus on the liberation period. And I know that you talked about this, but maybe this will provide you with a little bit more inspiration to get into other issues. So this question comes from Andrew Yu. Andrew Yu says, after Korea was liberated in 1945, there were major differences in ideology and vision from within in terms of what the new nation should look like. How did those differences originate? What types of groups were formed during the Japanese colonization and Korean independence movement that had an impact on those different types of visions?
Okay, that's a very, very big question.
Yeah, so no need to take this on comprehensively, but just any thoughts that sort of pop into mind about that topic.
I think, as I mentioned, of course, a big difference was their views on land. Right? I think one common thing that you see in both North and South Korea, which started in this period, is they had a strong belief in this power of the state. They both wanted to build strong states after liberation. But of course, the states were extremely different. Nationalists envisioned a more sort of liberal democratic state, whereas socialists envision a socialist state that would control the property of the country. Now, where did these come from? I mean, various forms of Western thought came into Korea through, of course, Japan. Right? Koreans could read English, but of course, one advantage was that they could learn Japanese very quickly. Like anyone who's fluent in Korean knows that they can pick up Japanese pretty quickly. And Japanese were great translators. Right? So Western forms of thought were translated very quickly into Japanese. So Koreans could read this. Some examples are that the famous Marxist thinker George Lukács, History and Class Consciousness, that was translated within 2 years into Japanese, within 2 years of its publication. So this was extremely quick. So again, it's important to stress how quickly the absorption of Western thought was in the 1920s and 1930s. You see newspapers commenting that, oh, if you look at young people today, everyone has a copy of Karl Marx's Capital. And of course, this would be the Japanese translation of Capital. And they had this Western books, Western thought was available. Lee Kwang-soo read Tolstoy's books in English because he could purchase them through Japanese book agents located in Seoul. Right? So again, even though Korea was a colony, its access to Western thought was actually pretty good and pretty rapid. Now, what kind of groups were formed? I say that intellectually, there were various groups. A lot of intellectuals emerged again even within the official colonial system. Right, so you see interesting people come from unexpected places. Like the Japanese established its own university, an imperial university in Seoul, 1926, or it started teaching in 1926, Keijo Imperial University. But some of the most famous Marxist thinkers were graduates of that imperial university, even though it was meant to produce supporters for it. So again, where a certain intellectual came out of doesn't necessarily determine what ideological orientation they had. That's because there were things called reading societies. There were unofficial reading societies where they read things separate from what was going on in the official curriculum. So it was these reading societies that determined close ties among intellectuals and what types of thought they were influenced by, rather than official education itself. And this is true both of students who study in Japan and in high schools and imperial universities in Korea itself. So that's how you can trace the differences in their thought. I think, and I could talk about this for much longer, but I think in the interest of getting to other questions, I think I'll leave it at that point. But we can, if there's any follow-up questions to this, I can answer them as well.
Sure. And I think this question could be its own presentation, right?
Yes.
So maybe next time we'll get you back for this one. So here's another. This is basically an international relations question. However, I think it has a strong history component. So let's see if this stimulates any thinking. This question comes from Alexander Jebin, and Alexander asks, do you think that acceptance by North and South of neutral status of a future unified Korea will help accelerate the unification process? And this is especially relevant historically because you were talking about how colonization prevented sort of an inter-Korean resolution of I think the phrase you used was something close to it froze the Korean history process or something to that effect. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on this one.
So I think, as I said, this is of course a very vexed issue. What people may not know is that the first foreign power to suggest neutrality for Korea was actually Japan. Japan did this in the 1880s because they thought Chinese influence was becoming too strong. So of course, Japan used this not for the sake of the Korean people, but of course to provide a wedge to sort of reduce Chinese influence on the Korean peninsula. Then it went through. So basically any foreign power that wanted to reduce another foreign power's influence in Korea would bring up neutrality. Right? So I think maybe if we could, the two Koreas could reach a point where the neutrality supported Korea's interests. We're focused on supporting Korea's own interests, and yes, giving it a space to resolve its own issues and to produce some sort of reunification. Maybe that would work. But I think the neutrality issue has, because of this history, has such negative connotations that those will also have to be worked out as well. I mean, at times, Russia discussed it, America discussed it, German advisor Paul Mollendorf discussed it, but nothing ever came of it. So Korea has had a bad experience with neutrality efforts in the past, but maybe South Korea is in a much more powerful position now, so maybe it would be different. I'm not sure about that.
So now we get to a couple of questions that ask us to envision what a future either unified Korean peninsula or some sort of settlement process, maybe a federated state, would look like. So first, Patrice Reyes asks, what would a successful reintegration of North and South Korea look like, especially with reference to all the unresolved sources of tension that you spoke about during your presentation? And then Patrice also asked, should integration be the ultimate goal, or would a sustained formal reconciliation be the best solution? So that's like a federation, right? And Fred Maas asks a very similar question. I just want to mention his name, that we did receive a question from him. What kind of country would a one Korea look like?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I think I would, or if anyone has the answer to that, they would get a Nobel Peace Prize for that. And as you know, historians deal with the past rather than the future. So I guess I know maybe a minimum of things that would need to be addressed, but
Right.
I don't know if I have the answers to this. I mean, and if you think about again, the long-term historical perspective on Korean history, what's really unusual about the modern period is, again, the constant foreign interference in Korea's affairs. One thing you would hope is that that a reunification would occur through and also result in less foreign interference. One thing that people forget about Chinese hegemony, before the 19th century, was that China really didn't interfere in Korea's internal affairs. It's purely an external thing. So Korea is used to having no interference in its internal affairs. And hopefully, and of course, we have the complete opposite situation now. I mean, to this day, we have foreign troops stationed on Korean soil. And this is something that, again, is very unnatural in Korean history. In fact, most foreign powers didn't want to station troops in Korea because, especially before the modern period, Korea was considered a miserable place to wage war. The terrain made it extremely difficult to conduct war. That was one of the factors, in fact, protecting Korea, was that no one wanted to wage war in Korea itself. In fact, even during the Korean War, top American military officials thought that Korea was a terrible place to engage in war. And that's why you see this in some of the memoirs of American soldiers, or books by David Halberstam, The Coldest Winter. They thought it was absolutely miserable to be in the country.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So one thing you like to see is at least a reduction of foreign interference in internal affairs in both Koreas. And we can see, then that will give us at least a shot at seeing what a future Korean peninsula would look like. And also, speaking again from the long perspective, it would be nice to see a Korean peninsula where its future is determined by actually the people itself, rather than just a handful of either outside powers or a handful of leaders. Right? We have not seen a Korea that is a result of, again, full democratic processes. Okay? So I think that's what we like to see. I mean, people say that economically integration should be fairly natural. You have a very industrial, advanced South, then you have a lot of labor in the North, right? But also potential things like hydropower in the North, also rare earth minerals in the North. North Korea has a lot of mining resources that can help the South. So, and this has already been seen in places like the Joseon industrial complex, where we have seen on a small scale industrial cooperation. Right? Probably the more difficult aspects to envision is for future Korea is culture, as Jonathan mentioned, culturally and socially. How will it happen? Would someone in the South want to marry someone from the North? I think defectors are facing this problem themselves. Right? So again, I don't think I have any specific answers on what a future peninsula would look like, but I would like to see it sort of returned to a more quote unquote normal historical state.
Right. Yeah, a lot of great food for thought there. So now another one that asks us to look at the future, but I think we could use history as our guide here. So Tae-Rae Kim from the UniKorea Foundation wants to know about the role that the Korean diaspora might be able to play in an integration process. And so I wanted to ask, is the current state of the diaspora, the Korean diaspora community with Koreans living all over the world, is that unique to Korean history, or is there precedent in history for this diaspora community? And what was sort of the relationship between those diaspora populations and the development of Korean history, intellectual society, and all that?
Well, I think as people know, the Korean diaspora had generally been pretty close to Korea itself. They've maintained close connection to Korea itself. And then with the development of more digital technologies, this has only been strengthened. People have easier access to food, to see TV shows, news, etc. So I think this means that people in the diaspora can, if they want, be more involved in the politics and processes going on. In certain places, maybe they could serve a bridge function, but still, if you think about it, it's one of the most dire situations where even in diaspora communities, you don't see mixing. You don't see any. There really aren't any areas where sort of there really isn't a North Korean diaspora, right? Quite comparable to this. Yeah, there is sort of a Soviet diaspora. They're immigrant communities, but I wouldn't necessarily see them as connected to North Korea as, say, Korean Americans are to, or Korean Canadians are to South Korea. But things like this, events that we're having, like that the Korea Society is sponsoring. These kind of events are encouraging discussion and dialogue in these diasporic communities. And I know a lot of discussions are already going. There are many organizations, large and small, that are working towards that, even in colleges in America as well, and colleges in Europe also. I think you would like to see more continued involvement of the diaspora community in this, but to do this, of course, they will need more tools to do so, especially those who do not speak or read Korean. So we will need more translation, more things made available to them. I think we already see a model for this in the Korean wave. It's amazing how much translation work is done of Korean dramas. I've seen dramas where if you click on the settings, they can be switched to subtitles in 5 or 6 different languages. This must be tremendous, not just for these countries, but for the diasporic Koreans in these communities. These people, especially second and third generation, who lack the language ability. And if somehow that energy can be brought to other areas, I think that could produce very fruitful results.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Michael Shin. If we were in our Korea Society office, you would get a warm round of applause. So please let me be the proxy for that warm round of applause. We got so many questions that we weren't able to get to. I think we got to a lot, but I just want to go through some of the names to thank these people. So Andrea Solis, Thomas Berry, Jeffrey Abrams, Koki Ohashi, James Osborne, Gio Kim, Gloria Steele, and Dorothy Hong, and Erica Kane. Thank you so much for sending questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them today. but we're aware that we've really taxed Mike's time and all of your expertise, and we're so happy that you were able to join us and shed some light on these really, really complicated but fascinating issues that I think are so important to have in terms of what a future integrated Korea would look like. We need to understand what the past looks like. So thank you so much. I hope you'll consider joining the Korea Society. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We've got lots of stuff coming up. On April 1st, we've got a program on Sino-Korean relations in the U.S. role. On April 16th, we've got one about role of regional players in Indo-Korean peace processes. So we'll look at Japan and Korea and some of the other regional countries, see what kind of role they might be able to play. And then May 20th, as I mentioned before, we've got that Inter-Korean Integration Cultural Program with Nambada from PS Core and Dr. Hyun-In Nae from Ewha Women's University. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hope to see you again soon at the Korea Society. Thanks to Peter, who was so instrumental in putting all the IT together, Claire for all her promotional help, Stephen, Dr. Stephen Norper for all his guidance with this program, and last but certainly not least, all of our interns who really were the ones that helping all this logistics to come together. So thank you to all of them. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.